Thank you, Madam President, and I want to thank my colleague from LA for her eloquent words. As chair of the Legislative Black Caucus, I want to thank all of my colleagues who have raised your voice today to speak to this important historical measure, a holiday that many of you here had never heard of before coming to the legislature. I have known too many of my colleagues year after having a Juneteenth celebration here in the legislature says, this is the first I ever heard of it. I didn't know about it until then. Tell me more. And it only lends itself to the continued miseducation of not only the Negro, but of America itself. The continuing whitewashing and the continuing lies of what America really is and who America really is. Juneteenth is important to my family because my entire family is from Texas. I grew up with a father who was adamant about celebrating Juneteenth. The last 10, 15 years of his life, he went back to Texas every year in June and spent the entire month of June in Texas celebrating. And he instilled it in each and every one of us, the importance of Juneteenth. Not 4th of July, but Juneteenth. And if you know your history, there are 3 things associated with Juneteenth: watermelon, red soda pop, and red velvet cake. And there are racial stereotypes that say African Americans like watermelon more. No, we don't. The significance of it was because of Juneteenth. And the red represented the blood that we shedded for this country as slaves, as people in the military, and it signified the blood that we lost. And that's why it was red soda pop, that's why it was watermelon, and that's why it was red velvet cake, to recognize the blood that we shed. It took almost 250 years of bondage, starting in 1619, for America to finally abolish slavery. It was 156 years later that we have been celebrating Juneteenth as the ending of slavery, and as we celebrate it not only in Texas, but it was also in Louisiana that got the word late too, as they migrated west to bring the message. But the bondage and the remnants of slavery still exist today in this country. And as my colleague from San Francisco so eloquently stated, all those things that we suffer from the most, the health disparities, the education, the lack of education, the homelessness, the mass incarceration, they're all center on race. We should ask ourselves, if we're really concerned about solving the homelessness, I should ask the question, how can 13% of the population represent 50% of homelessness if race is not at the core of everything that we do in this country? How can the greatest health disparities impact people of color if race is not the part of everything that we do? So if we're really about changing this country, we need to have a real conversation about race. And I'm honored that our U.S. Congress voted yesterday and that our president should put a signature today on recognizing Juneteenth as a national holiday. It's really a historic feat for this country. But again, I hope it's just not in words only, it has to be in actions. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, we'll remember not the words of our enemy, but the silence of our friends. It's too many of our friends silent on the real issues of importance here in this country, here in this state. And again, despite what we're doing across, celebrating Juneteenth, as stated, we have states all across this nation who want to deny the conversation of slavery and racism in this country. We want to remove it from our schools. That's the place where we should be encouraging it the most, to educate the next generation so they know the true story of American history. This year on Juneteenth will reflect the tenacity and the resolve that is present in the character of all African Americans. Though we overcome great obstacles in this dark past, we are still in the pursuit of true freedom. Freedom to be our true selves, our most authentic Black selves, without being threatened and being unapologetic for who we are. I stand here unapologetic as a Black man in this country, and I ask you for an aye vote on SCR 41, recognizing Juneteenth not only as a state holiday, but hopefully, as a national holiday by the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President, Senators. I too rise in strong support of SCR 41 on behalf of the Asian Pacific Islander Legislative Caucus, and I find myself challenged to follow the eloquent words of my good friend from Los Angeles. I would just make note that, and very soon we'll be celebrating also July 4th, Independence Day. In fact, on July 4th, 1776, our country, we declared our independence as a country in a document with many aspirations. Talks about, words of freedom, rights. But yet, when our country established its Constitution, we continued to include bondage and slavery for Black Americans. And in fact, as we are talking about Juneteenth and the events of June 19th, 1965, that's almost 89 years later after the Declaration of Independence, when finally a group of Americans were told that they were no longer in bondage, that we've kept our fellow Americans in bondage for 89 years. And so this is a very important recognition of the struggles of the African-American community, Black Americans, to just simply be free from bondage. Not equity, not equality, just simply free from bondage, at least legal slavery bondage. And their struggle is one that is essential to our understanding of our country and where we've come from and where we need to go. Certainly, as an Asian Pacific Islander, I appreciate the leadership and selfless advocacy of so many African Americans for my community. Frederick Douglass, Dr. Martin Luther King, Reverend Jesse Jackson are just a few examples of Black American leaders who have lent their voices in support of the API community. And our continued solidarity and support for one another in the face of racial injustice is part of bending that very long arc of the moral universe toward justice. We need to be sure we move forward together. And this resolution is a reminder that the fight for freedom and equality is an ongoing one and a very long one, but one that we must work hard to achieve. And certainly I want to express my appreciation for the leadership of Black Americans on behalf of all people of color, including the API community, in trying to achieve justice. So, paying tribute to Juneteenth is part of American history, and it's a history that we need to all learn and embrace, but not just know the history, but then commit ourselves together as Americans to achieve those ideals that were proclaimed by the founders back in 1776, but have not yet been achieved. So with that, I urge an aye vote on SCR 41. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise as a Californian, as a state senator representing District 24, in strong support of SCR 41 relative to Juneteenth. Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day or Emancipation Day, is symbolic in that it is considered the date when the last slaves in America were quote-unquote freed, almost 2.5 years after President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. I use the term quote-unquote freed loosely because it was outlawed, but what actually occurred were two very different realities. The abolition of slavery, however, did not bring equality. Juneteenth happened 89 years after the U.S. Independence Day, and it would be another 100 years before the civil rights movement gained traction and started to right the wrong of segregation. Yes, black men and women were quote unquote free, but they were not free to live where and how they wished. As I previously said on the floor, understanding our past and acknowledging our heroes of our different, diverse communities in California will strengthen the ties between every resident of this state. As we celebrate Juneteenth and ask all Californians to honor and reflect on the significant achievements and the impact that African Americans have played in the evolution and the success of this nation, we must continue this fight with the goal of ensuring real equality and real justice for our communities. I'd like to thank the author and the Legislative Black Caucus for your leadership every single day. Work on this important resolution and ask you to support SCR 41. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. I also rise in strong support of this resolution, the Legislative Black Caucus and Black Californians and Americans. Juneteenth is the oldest African-American holiday we observe in the United States, and it's important we recognize the history behind it. Slavery is a stain on our American history, but the end of slavery that we celebrate did not end systemic racism. It did not end anti-Black racism. These endure to today. We had 400 years of slavery in this country. It's been less than 160 years since we ended slavery, and we have plenty of work to do, as we see right now with the wave of voting restrictions that many of our counterparts across the country are passing right now in state legislatures. We have a lot of work to do to try to educate the population, and Juneteenth and recognizing Juneteenth is a very, very important start to acknowledge our country's mistakes, to serve as an educational, teachable moment for all of us. Members, I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Madam President. And ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, today I rise on behalf of the Legislative Women's Caucus and also as an educator who strongly believes in telling our history, no matter how dark it is, so that we educate and never forget and become better for it. Black women have been central to the celebration of Juneteenth and the commemoration of emancipation since the 19th century. Newly emancipated slaves walked off the plantation wearing the finest clothing from their mistresses through the Union Camp and dancing and celebration. Beginning in the late 19th century, Black women acted as public historians of the horrors and humiliations they had to endure to educate the next generation. They organized pageants, parades on Juneteenth and Emancipation Day in which costumed actors portrayed slaves and slaveholders, again to ensure that the atrocities of those eras were never forgotten. During the Great Migration, Black Texans moved to the West Coast, including cities like Los Angeles, Bakersfield, Oakland, and Sacramento, bringing Juneteenth with them. Up through the 20th and 21st century, the labor of Black women as community organizers, planners, activists, food preparers, and costume designers made Juneteenth celebrations possible. Juneteenth is a celebration of the freedom for which countless Black women have fought. Poet, abolitionist, orator, and suffragist Frances E.W. Harper urged white suffragists to stand up for their Black sisters. Upon hearing the words, "All people are born free and equal," in the Massachusetts Constitution, Elizabeth Mumford Freeman hired a lawyer and worked through the court system to earn her freedom. They paved the way for the Black women who have been critical and crucial to advancing culture, feminism, civil rights throughout our history. And women like activist Angela Davis, author Alice Walker, and our country's Vice President Kamala Harris have all been uplifted by those struggles. Juneteenth is a time of celebration, but also as a strong reminder that the fight for freedom and justice for African Americans is not over. 62% are confirmed sex trafficking victims. We have yet to achieve equity for Black women in our education system, healthcare system, and justice system. Once again, we must never forget the dark history so we can ensure it's never repeated again. And with that, I urge your aye vote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I rise as Vice Chair of the Legislative Jewish Caucus and individually in strong support of SCR 41. And I hope that, unlike the House of Representatives, we can make this vote unanimous today. It was tragic that there were some members of the House of Representatives who chose to vote against making Juneteenth a federal holiday, very similar to the resistance we saw to making Martin Luther King Day a federal holiday. And I really hope that we can make it unanimous today and show that we are not going down that divisive path. In the Jewish tradition, we have a concept called tikkun olam, healing the world. And what it acknowledges is that things that happened in the past, even though they may have been on the surface ended, whether it's the enslavement of the Jewish people in Egypt or the enslavement of black people in this country, it's a great thing to end those horrible wrongs, but we have to also look in the mirror today and see what lingers today and how we can fix that, how we can heal the world. And although slavery ended more than 150 years ago, we know that the vestiges of slavery continue until today. We have the modern day Jim Crow of our criminal justice system, which we see that it is clear as the day is long, the impacts that our criminal justice system is having on black and brown communities, and particularly on our black communities, in terms of the disproportionate policing, disproportionate killing of black men in particular, disproportionate incarceration of black people, disproportionate impacts in terms of homelessness, resulting in part from the criminal justice system. That is a stain on our society that lingers more than 150 years later, and we have not done what we need to do to fix that and to end that terrible injustice. We continue to see, and we see it around the country today, active movements in state legislatures around this country to try to prevent black people and other people of color from voting, to make it harder, and we need to call it out for what it is, to make it harder for black people and people of color to vote. When we saw the challenges to the last election, the challenges in a state like Pennsylvania or in Michigan or Georgia or whatever else, they weren't challenging the voting results in the white suburban communities. They specifically were challenging the votes in areas and cities with high black populations. When you had Pennsylvania state representatives who were claiming that they wanted to overturn the Pennsylvania results, well, you would think, well, that's your own elections. You were elected by the voters of Pennsylvania, but they weren't talking about their voters. They were talking about Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, areas where a lot of black people were voting. So we need to call this out for what it is. It's despicable, and it is still here today. So let's celebrate Juneteenth. The end of slavery was just an amazing step for this country, but we need to be looking in the mirror about what's happening in this country today, call it out, and put an end to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today in strong support of SCR 41 in honor of Juneteenth. Last year, while serving on my county's Board of Supervisors, we took a historic step toward inclusivity by becoming the first county in this state to make Juneteenth, our nation's oldest commemoration of the ending of slavery, a paid holiday for the county of Santa Clara. This proposal came after conversations with the community regarding race, equity, and systemic change during the demonstrations that followed the death of George Floyd. Now, with Congress following the lead of many counties and states across the country and passing the bill this week, as we all know, we will soon have Juneteenth as a federal public holiday across our nation, perhaps with a signature by the President as early as today. While slavery has ended, social, economic, and racial inequalities still permeate our communities, and we've heard that from so many today. And I want to thank the authors, all of the authors, and particularly my colleague from Los Angeles, And I want colleagues and my colleague from Gardenia and also want to associate my comments with my colleague from Sacramento, who indicated, I thought clearly, one of the problems that so many of us have had as we joyfully showed up for Juneteenth celebrations in our own districts, up and down this state, and as people did that across the country, knowing that we were celebrating Juneteenth without the full faith and credit of the United States of America, our own state, our own cities and counties, our own population, that we would give 2 weeks later on the 4th of July to celebrate the liberation of the 13 colonies and the rest of this country that happened earlier. It has always struck me to be a slap in the face, particularly to the black community in this country and in my own district, to say, we will celebrate Juneteenth, but you don't get the same respect on that day that the rest of Americans celebrate on July 4th. And I also want to indicate that we're not done. This is a great step toward true equity and representation, and I do think it indicates probably as strongly as anything is indicated in my 28 years in public service that things can change. Things can change, but a lot more has to change. My good friend who grew up in my neighborhood to lead the NAACP, Reverend Jeff Moore, packed up his belongings 2 days ago and his family and drove across the country to leave his hometown and move to Atlanta, indicating that his hometown was no longer welcoming to the black community. That's something I take very seriously, and though this is a huge step in the right direction, true equity, obviously, is still something that we have to reach for. Thank you, and I urge everyone's support for SCR 41. Thank you, Madam President.